the President's Dark Alliance. The Capitol building's stately corridors had rarely felt as cold as they did tonight. Vice President Henry Wolfe moved quickly, his well-honed instincts noting the absence of the usual aides and staffers who would typically be preparing for the President's arrival. Wolfe's hand brushed against his hip, a habit from his days in the field, back when he always carried a sidearm. He shook his head. He hadn't been on a combat mission in years, but old habits didn't die easily. The news was finally out. President Victor Price had reappeared. After vanishing for 4 days with no contact, he'd shown up suddenly, unannounced, and the press had wasted no time devouring every available scrap of information. The official story was thin, though, a last-minute, high-level diplomatic meeting in a secure location. But Wolfe knew better. Wolfe's history with Price went back decades. Price was a man of predictable principles, a calculated pragmatist with a steady hand and an unwavering focus on diplomacy. So the sudden change was impossible to ignore. When Wolfe saw Price for the first time since his return, it took only a few seconds for him to realize that something was wrong. Price sat at his desk, his back to the door, hands steepled in front of him. His usual warmth was gone, replaced by a stiff, distant posture. Wolfe moved around the desk to face him, but the President kept his gaze fixed on the documents in front of him, speaking without looking up. "Henry," he said, voice cool and measured, "I assume you've read the new energy brief?" Wolfe hesitated, studying the man he had once called his closest ally. "Yes, sir, I read it. You're authorizing unrestricted access to offshore drilling zones in the Atlantic." "That's correct." Price's tone was clipped, almost mechanical. "It's part of the accelerated energy strategy, a necessary move." Wolfe frowned. "Victor, these are plans we'd always agreed to revisit, years down the line after reviewing environmental impact reports, regulatory approvals. What changed?" Price's eyes finally lifted to meet Wolfe's. They were colder than Wolfe remembered, and a strange glassy sheen seemed to hang over them. "The world changed, Henry, and sometimes we have to change with it." Wolfe felt a chill run down his spine. There was a calmness in Price's voice, a forced, rehearsed quality. This wasn't just about policy. Something far deeper was eating away at the President, and it was clear Wolfe was supposed to fall in line without question. "Victor," Wolfe started, choosing his words carefully, "this doesn't sound like you. We've always been cautious with these measures. Can we discuss it further?" "Not this time, Henry," Price interrupted, his voice low and uncharacteristically sharp. "The timeline is set and the reforms are going through as outlined. Consider this a final decision." Wolfe blinked. Price had never spoken to him this way before, not in 20 years of partnership. He opened his mouth to press further, but Price had already turned back to his documents, dismissing Wolfe without another word. Back in his own office, Wolfe sat in silence, replaying the conversation over in his mind. He could feel something dark gathering in his gut, a deep, familiar feeling he hadn't felt in years. It was the same feeling he'd had during his last covert op, the one that had ended disastrously, the mission he'd never truly gotten over. Price had been uncharacteristically blunt, even cold. The man Wolfe had known for so long would never make a sweeping policy decision with such reckless abandon, especially not without consulting his team. As the hours passed, Wolfe's concern grew. Something in Price's eyes, the tone of his voice, lingered, gnawing at Wolfe's instincts. The following day, Wolfe's suspicions only intensified. Price bulldozed through several high-stakes meetings with senior advisors, each conversation ending with his stark, unyielding insistence on immediate action. Climate regulation protocols were slashed, offshore drilling initiatives escalated, and high-tech security contracts funneled to obscure companies that no one had vetted. For Wolfe, it all came down to a simple truth. This was not Price's style. Normally, he'd have spent hours deliberating with experts, analysing the potential consequences. The press soon began picking up on the oddities, with headlines speculating about the president's recent absence and sudden policy changes. Rumours swirled about possible health issues, burnout or political pressure, but Wolfe couldn't shake the sense that the answer was something far darker. 2 nights later, after combing through confidential reports, Wolfe came across a file buried deep within the White House medical database. The file was encrypted and marked with a clearance level Wolfe hadn't seen before. Fortunately, his position granted him access to almost every classified document in the administration's records. He cracked the encryption after a few minutes, and what he found was disturbing. It was a medical report dated the night before Price's reappearance. The report outlined a surgical procedure, a neural implant, administered to the president in an unlisted facility. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just any implant. It had a direct line to the brainstem, designed to influence neurotransmission and disrupt certain patterns of thought. The final line sent a chill through him. Implantation set to reach permanent integration within 72 hours. Wolfe closed his laptop and leaned back, feeling his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Permanent integration. If the implant fused with Price's brainstem, any chance of reversing it would be gone, and Price would be a puppet, an empty figurehead controlled by some invisible hand, and the clock was ticking. In the following days, Wolfe stayed close to Price, noting every slight alteration in his mannerisms. The president's speech patterns were becoming more stilted, his voice unnervingly monotone. Several close aides noticed as well, casting sidelong glances, but Price dismissed any concerns with a wave of his hand. Yet the unspoken worry was spreading. Wolfe's own worry hardened into resolve. If Price's behaviour continued to change, if the man he'd served and trusted was slipping further into the grip of this implant, then Wolfe would have to act. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. Wolfe called a late-night meeting with one of his few remaining allies, Lieutenant Colonel Jane Ramsey. She was former intelligence known for her precision and loyalty, a partner from his covert ops days. She arrived quietly, dressed in civilian clothes, her expression calm but curious. "What's going on, Henry?" she asked, her tone even. "Victor," Wolfe replied, handing her the medical report. "He's been implanted." Ramsey scanned the document, her expression darkening as she read. "This can't be happening," she whispered, looking up at Wolfe. "Who authorized this?" "I don't know," Wolfe said. "But whatever it is, he's not in control anymore, and in a couple of days it'll be permanent." Ramsey nodded grimly, understanding immediately. "What's the plan?" "Whatever's controlling him, we stop it," Wolfe replied. "I'm not losing him to some invisible force." Together they outlined their approach, knowing that each second mattered. As they stepped into the silent night, Wolfe couldn't shake the heavy knowledge that he was no longer simply a vice president. He was a man in a race against time, against something insidious that had taken hold of the highest office in the land. And he knew that if he failed, the country would be lost to forces beyond his darkest fears. In the days following their meeting, Wolfe and Lieutenant Colonel Jane Ramsey dove headfirst into investigating President Price's transformation. They worked in the shadows, using back channels to avoid triggering any alarms within the administration. Yet, the deeper they probed, the more unsettling the truth became. Their inquiries quickly revealed strange patterns. Since Price's return, he had held numerous unlisted meetings with foreign officials, always under the guise of energy strategy discussions. But these meetings were conducted in complete isolation, with no official documentation or recording, a stark departure from the protocols Price had adhered to his entire career. More troubling were the new contracts Price was fast-tracking, all tied to obscure corporations with cryptic names and even more cryptic histories. These companies seemed to have no clear ownership, no trail leading back to known investors or stakeholders. Wolfe recognized the telltale signs of a shell corporation network, something he'd encountered in covert operations designed to mask the identity of major players. This network seemed orchestrated, as if a hidden hand was steering the country's energy resources towards something larger, more sinister. As Wolfe navigated these revelations, his own access to classified files was increasingly restricted. Internal records began to vanish from his secure channels, and he'd find classified notifications on documents he'd reviewed only hours before. Then came the discovery that a cabinet member, someone Wolfe had known for years, had begun actively working against him, quietly blocking his initiatives and subtly undermining his authority. "We're being boxed in, Henry," Ramsey said during a late-night strategy session. "Whoever's behind this is onto us, and they're using people close to you to tighten the net." Wolfe nodded, his jaw set. "It's deeper than just Price. Someone's pulling strings across the board, with or without his knowledge." The next morning, Wolfe arrived at the White House only to find a security breach drill in progress. Secret Service agents lined the halls, ushering staff to secured areas. Wolfe's own detail met him at the entrance, guiding him through a maze of backup checkpoints. As he passed through the last checkpoint, something struck him as odd. There were no key members of the administration in the secure area. Only lower-level aides and administrative staff filled the room. Wolfe glanced at the head of his security detail, a man he trusted implicitly. The agent's tight, controlled expression betrayed nothing, but Wolfe knew immediately this wasn't a routine drill. This was an attempt on his life, disguised to look like a security exercise. Minutes later, a muffled explosion sounded from the east wing. The lights flickered, and Wolfe felt a rush of cold realization. The threat wasn't aimed at Price or any other target. This was meant to remove Wolfe from the equation. He kept his expression calm as he moved with the crowd, but his mind was already racing. As the drill concluded and he returned to his office, Wolfe found Ramsey waiting, her eyes steely. "Someone's trying to bury you, Henry," she said in a low voice. "We've got to be more careful." The attacks escalated. Wolfe's team faced a string of strange accidents in quick succession. 2 of his aides were run off the road in separate incidents, and one barely survived after his brakes mysteriously failed. Wolfe couldn't ignore the feeling of being hunted, not just by an alien force, but possibly by people within his own government who had either turned or been compromised. Wolfe began to sense the walls closing in. His entire life had been devoted to serving the country, to protecting it from unseen threats. Yet now the threat was slipping past his defences, poisoning the very core of the nation's leadership. As his paranoia grew, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. Sitting in his office one evening, the events of a disastrous mission from years ago flashed in his mind. Back then, he had failed to save a key ally, watching helplessly as the mission crumbled. The guilt had haunted him, filling him with a relentless need for redemption. This mission, this fight to save Price, had become his opportunity to make amends, to save a life that, in his mind, he was responsible for. Yet doubt gnawed at him, whispering that maybe Price was already lost. Maybe the man he once trusted was gone, his actions now guided by something unrecognizable. The tension reached new heights as news of Price's erratic policies leaked to the media. Speculation about Price's mental health filled the headlines, triggering public anxiety. Protests erupted outside the White House, with citizens demanding transparency from an administration that had suddenly grown cold and secretive. Ramsey warned Wolfe that every move they made was being scrutinized, not just by potential alien infiltrators, but by a wary, suspicious public. Wolfe was torn between exposing the alien agenda to gain the public's support or maintaining a facade of stability to prevent widespread panic. It was a tightrope act, and every step forward risked tearing the administration apart from the inside. It was then that Wolfe and Ramsey decided to bring in a specialist, an NSA tech expert known for decoding high-level encrypted communications. They fed him recordings of Price's speeches, hoping to find anything that might explain the president's behavior. After hours of painstaking analysis, the expert sat back, his face pale. "These speeches, they're not just words," he said. "They're coded with something deeper, embedded phrases that affect the subconscious, shaping how people interpret Price's message." Wolfe's stomach dropped as the expert continued, explaining that the phrases acted like trigger words, subtly manipulating public perception, fostering trust in Price's leadership, while clouding his erratic decisions. It was the perfect psychological weapon, altering the minds of listeners without their knowledge. This was confirmation of something far darker than Wolfe had anticipated. The aliens weren't merely controlling Price, they were bending the entire country to their will. "This is a level of influence we can't fight openly," Wolfe said, his voice steady but his mind churning. "They're not just targeting Price, they're reaching into the minds of everyone listening to him." Ramsey looked at Wolfe, her expression grim. "We're not just fighting to save the President, Henry. We're fighting for the country's free will." The revelation hardened Wolfe's resolve. The alien threat wasn't abstract or distant. It was here, embedded in the very speeches Price delivered to the nation. And Wolfe knew time was running out. With Price's neural implant nearing permanent activation, Wolfe and Ramsey were left with one choice: to break the alien control before it fused completely, or risk losing the country to an unseen enemy. As they prepared for the next phase, Wolfe felt the weight of the task settle over him, heavier than any mission he had ever faced. This wasn't just about saving a friend. It was about preserving the very foundation of the nation. And he knew he couldn't afford to fail. The call came in the dead of night, a message flagged urgent from Wolfe's closest operative. It was time. Wolfe and Lieutenant Colonel Ramsey moved swiftly, contacting Price's staff with a false emergency alert, a severe, undiagnosed health issue that required immediate intervention. Within minutes, a black SUV whisked the president from the White House to a secure underground facility, a medical installation hidden beneath an old government building with only a handful of insiders aware of its existence. Price was escorted in, dazed, his expression blank as Wolfe met him at the door. Wolfe forced a smile and placed a hand on Price's shoulder, masking the tension that rippled through him. His old friend's face was devoid of any emotion, like an empty vessel. "We'll take care of you, sir," Wolfe murmured, keeping his tone soft. But he saw no recognition in Price's eyes, no hint of the man he'd once known. Wolfe turned to Ramsey, giving a subtle nod. "Let's get started." Inside the sterile confines of the operating room, Wolfe's team assembled their equipment. The disruptor, a hastily constructed device pieced together with components gathered over weeks of covert planning, emitted a low hum, its sensors trained on Price. The device was designed to interfere with the implant, blocking the signals that kept Price's mind under alien control. Ramsey activated the machine and the disruptor pulsed, bathing the room in an eerie, faint blue light. Price's expression flickered, his gaze sharpening as he blinked, confusion and recognition finally surfacing in his eyes. Henry! Price's voice was weak, his eyes darting around the room as if piecing together fragments of a shattered memory. What's happening to me? Wolfe stepped closer, his tone gentle but urgent. Victor, you've been compromised. There's an implant controlling you. It's manipulating your thoughts, your actions. Do you remember anything? Price's hand trembled as he raised it to his head, fingers brushing the back of his neck where the implant rested. He closed his eyes, and his expression contorted with the strain of fighting for control. I remember pieces, he murmured, voice barely audible. Meetings. They told me I'd lead Earth into a new era, but they never said at what cost. Price's voice grew softer, like a man talking to himself in a nightmare. They said it was for humanity's future, that our leaders had already agreed to it. What leaders? Wolfe pressed, his tone laced with urgency. Victor, tell me who's involved. Price's gaze met Wolfe's, filled with a desperate clarity. They were working with them, Henry. Foreign officials, CEOs, powerful people around the world. They want our planet, Henry, as a resource colony. And I made it possible. He broke off, clutching his head as if trying to push back against the alien forces in his mind. I can feel them pulling, Henry. I've opened the gates. I let them in. Ramsey shot Wolfe a worried glance, her hands on the disruptor, recalibrating as the implant's influence began to reassert itself. Wolfe leaned closer to Price, gripping his shoulder. Victor, stay with us. We need you to fight this just a little longer. Price's eyes glazed over again, his body tensing. His voice turned cold, mechanical. Initiate next phase. Secure assets. Eliminate dissent. Wolfe's stomach twisted. Ramsey adjusted the disruptor's frequency, pushing the implant's control back, and Price returned momentarily, visibly weaker but aware. With trembling hands, Price reached for Wolfe, his fingers gripping tightly. Henry, if they take me again, you must tell the world. Expose everything. It'll rip the country apart, but it's the only way. Wolfe hesitated, the weight of Price's words sinking in. If he revealed the truth, the country might plunge into chaos, panic, distrust, possibly worse. But he knew Price was right. If they lost him now, silence would mean submission, a slow surrender to forces no one could see. Before Wolfe could respond, a sharp metallic sound rang out as the door burst open. Standing in the entryway was the cabinet member who'd been working against him, flanked by 2 armed operatives. The cabinet member's face was unnervingly calm, his eyes as cold and empty as Price's had been under alien control. Vice President Wolfe, the cabinet member intoned, you and your team are conducting unauthorized procedures on the president. Stand down immediately. Wolfe and Ramsey exchanged a quick, wordless glance. They knew what this meant. The alien's influence extended even further than they'd feared. Stand down, Wolfe replied, his voice steady but defiant. You think I'd let you keep him under your control? The cabinet member's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. He gave a curt nod to the operatives, who aimed their weapons at Wolfe and Ramsey. Wolfe's heart pounded, but he held his ground. In one swift movement, Ramsey activated the disruptor to its maximum capacity. A high-pitched hum filled the room as the blue light intensified, flooding the space with energy. The operatives hesitated, disoriented, giving Wolfe the opening he needed. With trained precision, Wolfe lunged forward, knocking one of the operatives off balance. A shot rang out, echoing in the confined room, but Ramsey was already moving, disabling the other operative with a well-placed strike. The cabinet member staggered, clutching his head as the disruptor's frequency washed over him, revealing the strain of the implant's control. He looked at Wolfe, his gaze flickering between rage and desperation. "You don't understand," he rasped, his voice a guttural whisper. "You can't stop it. The takeover is inevitable. You're only delaying it." Wolfe's jaw clenched. "Maybe, but I'll delay it as long as I can." In a final push, Ramsey recalibrated the disruptor's signal, targeting Price's implant with renewed focus. Price's eyes fluttered, and for a moment he was fully present. The man Wolfe had once trusted implicitly. "Henry," Price murmured, his voice weary but resolute, "you know what you have to do." Wolfe nodded, his voice thick. "Yes, I do." With a last burst of energy, Wolfe's team managed to disable the implant, severing the alien influence over Price. But, as they did, Wolfe was left with the inevitable, final decision: whether to reveal everything to the public. Price's implant would soon be known to the world, along with the alien agenda that had infiltrated the highest echelons of global power. But this exposure came with a cost, and Wolfe felt the weight of it pressing down on him. The country would panic, trust in the government would erode, stability would be shattered. But he also knew that silence would mean far worse: a steady march toward domination from forces hidden in plain sight. He turned to Ramsey, who nodded, understanding his unspoken decision. With a heavy heart, Wolfe picked up the encrypted device that would release the truth to the world. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "The truth is our only weapon." As he pressed the button, sending the transmission to the media, he knew the consequences would be severe. But in that moment, Wolfe felt a fierce resolve. He had protected his friend and exposed an invisible threat. And while he couldn't predict the chaos that would follow, he knew this was the only path to true independence, a fight not for a presidency, but for humanity itself. The fallout was immediate. Within hours of Wolfe's transmission, newsrooms across the country scrambled to cover the overwhelming truth. An alien influence had infiltrated the highest levels of government. Live broadcasts swung between disbelief, outrage, and fear as the magnitude of the revelation began to sink in. Civilians took to the streets, demanding answers, the bedrock of public trust now splintered and trembling. Wolfe watched from a small, dimly lit office, the glow of the television screen casting shadows across his face. He knew this was just the beginning. The truth had finally come to light, but the country would face a long and grueling reckoning. Next to him, Price sat silently, his expression weary and hollow. Stripped of control and facing the weight of his own actions under alien influence, he looked older than Wolfe had ever seen him. For Wolfe, a strange sense of calm had settled in. For the first time since that disastrous mission years ago, he felt a measure of redemption. He had chosen to act, to make the call he'd once failed to make. But he knew that this decision, this moment of truth, was only the beginning. In the days that followed, the world reacted as if waking from a long nightmare. Price addressed the nation in a live broadcast, his voice steady but strained. He explained the alien manipulation, his own forced role, and the horrifying scale of what they had uncovered. Around the world, leaders issued statements, some vowing to investigate their own ranks, while others tried to distance themselves from the scandal. Protests swept through major cities, and demands for government accountability echoed across borders. Wolfe felt the world shifting, the weight of the revelation sparking a movement he hadn't anticipated. Next to him, Ramsey had already begun work on a new initiative, pulling in trusted operatives and scientists to establish a coalition that would track and monitor any remaining alien influence. It was a shadow organization operating in full daylight, the beginning of what they decided to call the Interspecies Defense Network, They combed through files, surveillance footage, any remnants of alien activity. They worked methodically, with the grim understanding that the fight to regain control wasn't over. It was only beginning. One late evening, as the last of the lights dimmed in his office, Wolfe was preparing to leave when he noticed a message flash on his personal encrypted device. His heart skipped. No one had access to this line. The screen displayed a single chilling message. "Your signal has been received." Wolfe's pulse quickened as he opened the message, a few short lines scrolling across the screen in stark silence. "You've done well to expose this first layer, but know that we have woven ourselves into your systems, your networks, your minds. This was only a test. The real campaign begins now." Wolfe stared at the message, the weight of its meaning settling over him. He looked out over the quiet city, lights twinkling beneath the deepening night. The truth they'd revealed was only a fragment of a larger, more insidious network, one that infiltrated not only government, but the very technology people relied on every day. The real battle, he realized, would be far more difficult, hidden in plain sight, embedded within their own lives. Taking a steadying breath, Wolfe turned away from the window. The mission had only just begun, and he knew that no one else was prepared to face what lay ahead. He'd exposed the first layer, but now he would have to fight to keep humanity free. The future demanded vigilance, courage, and a resolve he was only beginning to understand. And as he looked back at the glowing city below, he felt a surge of determination. They were watching, but so was he.